Welcome to Business Talk here on Business Tech, where we are concluding our special sustainability themed series. And it really is about what were the key outcomes from the COP27 climate summit, which recently concluded in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt. It was probably something of a double-edged outcome to negotiations that at times seemed to be on the brink of failure, but we did see a very, very important breakthrough on loss and damage in particular, while maybe some issues we just stood still on. Anyway, it's a great pleasure to welcome our intrepid COP watcher, Clémence McNulty, EY Climate Change and Sustainability Services Leader. Clémence, great to chat to you again. It was always billed as the execution COP. So I guess to look for any groundbreaking new developments against that backdrop was probably asking for a little bit too much. And we opened, and I recall this headline, "On the Highway to Climate Hell," and global leaders certainly delivered emotional pleas for the safety of humanity. What stood out for you at a broad level?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And thanks for having me again. So I think, as with these, any of these conferences, there's always some good, some things that could have been better, and certainly some food for thought for the upcoming ones. I mean, obviously it was billed as an execution COP and also billed as the Africa COP. And certainly one of the highlights was the agreement to set up a fund around loss and damage, which was a very big topic of issue for the developing country bloc, and certainly, important in terms of Africa, the sort of impacts we're starting to come through. I think some of the other positives certainly were a discussion on the continued need for finance and probably how fit for purpose is our global kind of development institutions and multilateral development bank sort of landscape to do this, and certainly discussion around how do we think about reform or really enhancing the role of those banks to fund what we need. And then, I think what's interesting was there was a lot of discussion around the interlinked areas. So food security, agriculture, the blue economy, how does this whole part fit in, and obviously biodiversity around some of the things that we need to do around climate change. One of the more technical areas that was good was the inclusion of wording around tipping points. I think we chatted about it before, but the tipping points being really the thresholds that the science tells us that we shouldn't go over. And I think to get it into the sort of high level text was important, because it really does highlight the view that we really need to avoid those tipping points. And then certainly there was also quite a lot of additional kind of work around reporting on net zero commitments. There was a report from the UN group of experts on reporting by companies on net zero commitments, putting out a lot more recommendations. And I think that's very good, because it's forcing attention on what good practice looks, and we need that, of course. Not so otherwise, good, maybe.
You could just maybe on that point, otherwise, and I've always probably been a little bit cynical about net zero being too far out in the future, and executives can, say all the right things and write all the fluffy niceties in the sustainability report, but if you're not measured to exacting standards and held to account, it does become a little bit nebulous.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think this issue of greenwashing, the other terms that I've heard recently is green wishing, where obviously we were very ambitious, and then actually a worrying trend around green hushing, where companies are weary of making commitments because they're scared of the potential backlash if they're found not to meet them, which is also not a positive space. But I think the reality is, it's probably about 20 years. I think, the GHG protocol was published in 2001. That was the first kind of standard that we had for reporting on corporate emissions, where we started talking about scope 1 and 2 and 3 emissions and things. So if you think about that, it's still very new, right? So we need to have these standards evolve, but absolutely agreed, right? We need some integrity in the system so we can trust what's out there and make decisions against it.
And, you say 20 years around that issue. I recall loss and damage first being raised in the 90s. I mean, that's an issue that's been with us almost 30 years. And finally, we had it included in the text. But maybe for viewers there who are not au fait with all of the COP lingo, firstly, this phrase loss and damage is often bandied about. What does it mean? What are we talking about specifically?
Yeah, so essentially losses and damage is recognizing, I guess, unfortunately, that we're not going to be able to mitigate enough or even adapt enough to avoid the significant impacts that we know are going to come through from climate change, especially sort of physical climate risks, right, around
like
extreme
floods
droughts or floods. So we've had the example of Pakistan, and Pakistan was a very big voice at this COP27 in terms of this loss and damage context. And so it's really saying, for the countries that have had a very little historical contribution in terms of climate change, the most vulnerable, still least developed countries in the world, they're really going to need specific funds, not just to adapt or to mitigate, but just to address the loss and damage that they will experience from these extreme weather events. And you're right, that discussion has been ongoing since the beginning of COP. And so it was a big breakthrough this year that recognition has come through, and that there was an agreement in terms of recognizing that and setting up a special mechanism to fund it.
That, when you get into the weeds of the issue, is really where the devil lies, in that kind of detail. Who pays, who gets paid, how do you work out based on your percentage of emissions versus based on your country status, from least developing to middle income to developed. I mean, that's really where things get a bit tricky, isn't it?
Yeah, and there was no agreement on that at this one. And I suspect it will become, probably an ongoing point of contention. And obviously, I mean, if you think about 1992, when the framework was set up for the UNFCCC and these COPs that we are seeing, there was always this principle of common but differentiated responsibility. So we're all going to feel these impacts because climate change is a systemic risk. But at the same time, we're all at different stages of development. We've all had different kind of historical contributions to it. And so at the time, you had what was called Annex 1 countries, which were the most developed countries, the ones that would have had also significant impacts. So that would have been Europe, the US. And then you had other countries, Annex 2 countries, that would need to participate, but would not necessarily be as much in focus. So for example, China at the time was one of those countries. But obviously we know that, China, in terms of the role that it plays, the size of its economy has had significant changes, obviously, in the last 30 years. And so questions around, for example, would China have to specifically fund, loss and damage, would be the types of discussions that would have to come through, and exactly what forms that funding would take is obviously another important one. I mean, we've obviously seen a lot of discussion around, grants versus concessional loans and some of the other areas. Obviously, this is really intended to be much more like grant funding. But yeah, this will certainly be part of the discussion at the upcoming events.
I can imagine it keeping climate lawyers gainfully employed still for years to come, because it is extremely complex. And you're talking about a political issue, because political leaders are going to have to get their tax-paying voting public behind these decisions. But it's a global issue, as you say, it's systemic. It's a global commons that we're talking about. And the fact that we even got the text included, I should say, softened probably even the most hardened cynic around the issue. Now, when it comes to real tangible movement in terms of carbon markets, I think there was some really interesting developments around that. Article 6, obviously very important for companies wishing to understand how carbon markets are developing. Firstly, what is Article 6? And then we'll go into a bit more about Article 6.2 and 6.4.
Yeah, so Article 6 essentially is the rule book that's being put in place to regulate carbon markets under the Paris Agreement. So it's essentially, obviously, we know that we've got voluntary carbon markets, but it's essentially the sets of rules, if I can put it that way, that are being put in place to allow countries to cooperate around their emission reduction targets, and to use either sort of bilateral or multilateral agreements to trade some of these, or much more like the clean development mechanism was at the project level, to be able to trade credits in that way. So it will be a much more regulated space than obviously what we have at the moment in terms of the voluntary carbon market.
And that's important because then you're really getting the market to start to develop and drive a lot of these positive changes that we're seeing around offsets. Just remind us, what's the difference here then between Article 6.2 and 6.4 market mechanisms?
Yeah, so it gets very technical very quickly. So I have to admit, even myself, I'm not a carbon market expert, and I know the conversations at this COP, even the experts found that they were a little bit tough at times and certainly very tedious. So I guess just one thing to say is, if you're looking to understand this, it really does get quite technical very quickly. But generally, Article 6.2, so instruments under Article 6.2 are really about agreeing how 2 countries or maybe 3 or 4 countries will be able to link essentially their emissions trading schemes and then a cross account for reductions that would come through. And so you've got this term that's coming through, and it's always this alphabet soup in climate change. So the new term is, in terms of Article 6.2, internationally transferred mitigation outcomes, so an ITMO, and that would be where if a country develops something that it reduces its emissions, being able to resell it. So what we're seeing is, for example, Switzerland having already completed some agreements, for example, with Ghana, where I think they had a project around stovetops and starting to agree at a country level how you account for that.
And I mean, one could think here, regenerating the Amazon rainforest, for example, as a way to develop a tradable instrument that one might be able to use at a national level. So without getting, because we can really get stuck in the weeds of this, without getting too stuck in the technicalities, for you at a high level, was this the right kind of outcome that we needed to start to see market-based solutions finding a way to either reduce carbon emissions or at least ensure that where countries that are far down the road are at least able to subsidize some of the development of maybe the more developing countries along that spectrum?
Yeah, so I think, as I said, this gets very technical very quickly. So out of this COP, there were a couple of good things that came through around obviously preventing double counting. There were agreements around making sure that you would have corresponding adjustments in one country's nationally determined contributions versus the other side. So you don't have this issue of double counting, which has obviously been one that companies have been or stakeholders have been worried about. The reality is that the rules are still not 100% agreed. So there's still discussion around, how the format of the reports, the supervisory body, how it will be set up, but there was progress. So going back, you're right, these 2 Articles 6.2, and then there's a 6.4, which is more on a project level, like the clean development mechanism that we had previously. It seems the project level, so the Article 6.4 is a little bit easier. And so the latest view is that the registry for projects, which will keep a view of everything that's been put in place, should be available from June 2024, whilst the agreement in terms of 6.2 is maybe a little bit further. But what's interesting, and that's why I mentioned, is that some countries are already going ahead without all of the framework being developed and signing some of these bilateral or multilateral agreements. And certainly there's enough in place probably that you can put projects or agreements in place, and then you'll be able to convert them once everything is set up under the registry for Article 6.
I think that's very interesting, because I was wondering what the implications might be if you're formalizing something like this a little bit more, because it's been a voluntary carbon market up to this point, and whether or not, some might just wait back and say, well, if we're going to have formal rules, we'll rather just sit back and wait to see what the rules of engagement are. But from what it sounds like, you're saying that many countries are just going ahead anyway because they can see ultimately that we're going to have a formal market in any event. So and then what happens to the clean development mechanism, which was really a Kyoto Protocol intervention? Does that fall away?
So at the moment, you can't develop new CDMs, but you can certainly extend approvals for existing projects. And the intention is that any projects that were set up, after I think January 2013 should be available to use towards your nationally determined contribution. So I think there'll be some sort of equivalencies that will come through. But yeah, absolutely. I think for project developers, especially where we're seeing the project level. So whether you go for the Article 6.4 route or you stay within the voluntary carbon markets, there are going to be decisions to be made by developers.
And I think another big issue, given the context of this COP, in that it took place against this backdrop of the European energy crisis, many in Africa, some might say opportunistically, were pointing to the fact that countries like Germany and others had started to, increase their reliance on coal because of the gas issues. And there's been a lot of attention on whether Africa will also turn to fossil fuels as a so-called interim transition fuel in light of this energy crisis. Do you think that was debated much? What was your sense of the tone and tenor of that kind of conversation in Sharm el-Sheikh?
Look, I think it's going to be an ongoing discussion. Certainly what we saw at COP27 was a lot of the European countries, I would say, really highlighting that whilst they've made some short-term adjustments to guarantee security of supply and energy security in their markets, the kind of medium-term, long-term commitment to decarbonization has not slowed down. And in fact, I do still think that the key message was, if we had gone faster, we probably would not have had some of the challenges that we're seeing. So, I think from their side, whilst there's certainly been a view that they need to secure these supplies, I don't think there's a fundamental change in terms of the strategies. So within that landscape, there was certainly a lot of discussion around Africa, the development that we still need to do. What do we do with our endowment, especially gas as a transition fuel? And I think, obviously, we saw, I think there was a report, there were around 20 gas deals that were made on the sideline of COP27. That speaks also to the activity that you see. The good thing is that I think there were more renewable energy or clean energy commitments and deals that were made. So, on balance is probably right. But, I think that discussion will continue. The reality is that in an African context, Africa should think very carefully about any lock-in that we might have, whether there will be a future market. I mean, one of the things that I've seen a lot debated is, well, we need it for our own development. What if instead of, burning wood, all our households were able to use gas for cooking, for example? And that would not just have climate change benefits, but it would also have significant pollution health benefits for communities. If that's what we are trying to achieve, and we've got the right regulation that this gas doesn't just flow everywhere else, then that might make sense. But I think we do have to be quite careful in terms of exactly what we're intending to use that gas for. And certainly, the reality is that we're going to see these carbon border tax adjustments coming through. We're going to see the areas where they will be moving forward with their own decarbonization, probably making sure that they're not going to be uncompetitive. And that could be massively detrimental to us if we lock ourselves into something that's not going to be sustainable.
Yeah, otherwise, a lot of that infrastructure is very capital intensive, long lead time, and could become a stranded asset, unless maybe, and also in green hydrogen, you're thinking about retrofitting some of the infrastructure like pipelines to carry, green hydrogen. Then you start to talk about a more integrated approach here. That said, it did look like South Africa, again, made all the right moves when it came to our own Just Energy Transition Partnership. The JET IP was launched. A lot was made about the number that the president put on the total investment that South Africa will need, around 1.5 trillion rand. And we've got our $8.5 billion, which is just over 130 billion rand. So getting us there, but not even 10%. What was your sense around the progress that South Africa made? And can you just give us an update on where we are with regards to that JET P?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think I attended certainly a couple of events at the South Africa Pavilion, and I have to say, that the plan is extremely well thought out. And I think the model that South Africa has put out is certainly one that's been looked at. We obviously saw Indonesia coming with their own, JETP type of plan. And I think one of the key highlights was that there was this really strong recognition from the international community that it's been very well thought out. They liked the way that business and government have come together under the auspices of the Presidential Climate Commission, and really had a discussion and identified some of the transition opportunities as well in terms of green hydrogen, electric vehicles. So I think generally lots of positive statements, obviously lots of discussion around the exact type of financing that we get, how much of it will be grants versus concessional loans, how much extra debt, what might we take on, and that's obviously appropriate in the global economic context. And obviously that's part of what's being detailed out now. So certainly understand that, from the detailed plan now, we need to go into the detail of the exact financing mechanism, and also need to have something in place so that we can get all of this additional private sector investment that we know that we need, because ultimately we need to use a JETP to catalyze further investment in terms of this just transition. So I think lots of excitement in terms of the strengths of the plan, the fact that it's been well thought out, that there has been stakeholder engagement, but really a real call to now we need to execute. It's all about execution and moving into action. And that's where things will really come together. And obviously we've got this great urgency, we know, not just climate change, but the reality of load shedding that we are dealing with at all times, and really just also making sure that that gets driven out very quickly.
Yeah, and I think we really have to acknowledge the work that's been going on. National Business Initiative under Jan Yar, which really driving a lot of that from businesses side, where Crispian Olver and Steve Nichols on the Presidential Climate Commission side, and really good to see that kind of public-private partnership, which is rising to the surface under the Ramaphosa administration. So we hope now we can take that excellent plan and start to execute on it. Now, where do we go from here, Clémence? I mean, you've been around the block, you've seen a fair few COPs. Where do we go from here?
Yeah, so look, I mean, the reality is that action, and this was another one of the kind of key benefits that came through, action needs to be localized. So this is a systemic change that we need to address. It's a common good, so we're all exposed to it, but action will only work if it's localized. So there was a lot of discussion even within an African context of the role of municipalities, and how do we kind of get climate finance to municipalities who can spend it in the most judicious way, that also play such a key role in terms of that resilience, that adaptation. So I think the kind of next steps are obviously localization, moving from plan to execution, which we know is always a challenge. And I think for the private sector, which is a critical stakeholder, to really engage around the opportunities that link into that JETP plan, to understand some of the expectations that are evolving around reporting, around these net zero commitments. There was also discussions around, the International Sustainability Standard Board and some of the impacts of that. So I think there is definitely a very strong role for the private sector, but private sector must really understand that they need to have very strong plans and really strong disclosures around their role. And then probably a broader discussion around, what's the next steps for COP? Is it still the right format? Do we need to evolve it? And I think that will remain important. Even is it right to have an annual big meeting like this, or do we just need to move to a smaller format? And then, the cadence is more around reporting back on action. So all of these things will need to be considered.
Yeah, but with maybe a big COP every 5 years. And I tend to kind of go along with that thinking as well. It will only increase in magnitude as we head into Doha next year, which, as we know, is trade fair mecca of the world. But really, Clémence, it's been a real pleasure getting your insights as someone who is really up close to these issues here on Business Talk over the last few months. Great pleasure chatting to you. I'm sure we'll be chatting to you in the new year as we get more clarity around execution here in South Africa. Take care.
Brilliant.